This is one of the most fun football arcade games that I've ever played.
I'm open. Ow.
Well, I think you can call this a football game, that is. Anyway, Midway's Pigskin 621 AD is unlike any other football game I've ever seen. And actually, when you really get into this, it's a lot of fun. You know, I'm really not sure how to describe this game. It's like no other football game I've ever seen, and I'm not sure that this is even a football game. Honestly, this is the sort of game that not a whole lot of people on YouTube talk about. And it's games like this that are the reason why I started this channel, so we can talk about stuff like this. So as you guys know, I cover a lot of subjects on Action Football Sundays that other people don't. I really want to keep this stuff coming. Anyway, if you enjoy this content, you want to see more, please consider becoming a channel member here on YouTube. So here on YouTube, it costs $4 a month. It gives you early access to videos just like this one. I'll let you watch videos as soon as I finish them and as soon as I've uploaded them. Or if you're interested in different perks, go check out my Patreon page. So I've got a Patreon page that covers new uploads for all of my channels, as well as a whole bunch of bonus stuff, and I'm going to create a lot more of that bonus stuff here in the near future. This page also includes my huge library of vintage sports broadcasts, which totals 8.5 terabytes at the moment and is still growing. And I've got some exclusive videos over on Patreon as well, and I'm going to have more of those coming up. We'll do one a week. Anyways, so go check that out. This is a great way to support the channel, and it helps make it possible for me to talk more about crazy games like this one. And honestly, I'm not really sure even where to begin with Pigskin 621 AD. The idea behind this game is to get rid of all the rules and take football back to its medieval origins, at least I guess. You can't choose any plays in this game. All you do is you get the ball, you avoid obstacles, you move to the right, and you punch the other team. Unlike the other football arcade games of the 1980s, this game has absolutely no playing calling and only minimal strategy. Believe it or not, that's actually the thing that makes this game so much fun. And yeah, this was a huge departure from what every other company was doing at this time. I've already done videos on some of these football arcade games, but there are a few that I've skipped over, and we'll go back, we'll cover them again. Midway was really the first company to think of making a football game that was deliberately inaccurate. In other words, the first one that wasn't some kind of simulation. As you already know, 10-Yard Fight from way back in 1983 was really the first of its kind. Of course, you can't really call any plays in this game, though you can use strategy depending on the formation that the computer decides to use. Now obviously, I totally suck at this game, but those of you who don't suck at it tell me that it's basically a puzzle game just like a lot of the early arcade games. And it's fun in the sense that it gives you like a mental challenge, but it really drives me up the wall, and it's just too old-fashioned to hold any interest, at least in my mind. Anyway, it didn't take long for football arcade games to evolve past 10-Yard Fight. A company named Tecon created Gridiron Fight in 1985. Gridiron Fight was very similar to Tecon World Cup, a 1985 game that was quite popular and successful in Europe. Anyway, Gridiron Fight is a bit faster than World Cup, but it's still really hard to figure out what you're like supposed to do. The very next year, Tecon changed its name to Tecmo. And you guys all know about Tecmo, right? But you might not know that there was a Tecmo Bowl arcade game before the NES game was created. And no, I'm not talking about the Nintendo Versus System version of Tecmo Bowl. No, I'm talking about the original Tecmo Bowl arcade game, which has a lot in common with Gridiron Fight, believe it or not. So the Tecmo Bowl arcade game had this wide screen approach, though I'm not really sure I understand why it was this wide. Anyway, the game is a lot slower than the NES versions, and it's actually slower than Gridiron Fight, believe it or not. It's also really easy when you figure out how to fight off tacklers. The most obvious connection between the two games comes when you score. You can clearly see just how much faster Gridiron Fight is here. Both games do this really strange screen scrolling thing to show the crowd. I don't know what the purpose behind this is. And then there's one more classic arcade football game from this era, one that I just can't quite figure out. So that would be this game, Quarterback by the Leyland Corporation. I'll be honest, I can't figure out how the emulator wants me to play this game. You can also see that the colors here look like a mess. This is because of OBS. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, fortunately there was a later version of Quarterback, and unfortunately the later version was not much better. The same company got the rights to use John Elway's name in 1988 and put the exact same game out again. At least this time the emulation works, even though the game really sucks. I think the problem here is that the arcade control mechanism is really hard to recreate on a computer. But even when I'm able to complete a pass, this game is just simply awful. And believe it or not, the NES version of this game is even worse. Anyway, as you can tell, Midway did not exactly have a lot of fierce competition when it came out with Pigskin 621 AD. I mean, the only other serious game out there was a 1983 game called NFL. It used NFL Films highlights on a type of laser disc. You would like choose your play and it would like randomly come up with the highlights. Anyway, unfortunately, I can't get that game to run, but I've got a feeling that we're really not missing out on much. Pigskin 621 AD was different though, that's for sure. The thing is that getting rid of the structure and rules behind football just makes this a better arcade game. Midway decided to make a game that was fun to play first rather than worrying so much about the play calls and all the rules of American football. There are some parts that kind of suck. For example, the processor has a real hard time dealing with this zoomed out mode and everything winds up just slowing down. But the gameplay itself is really a lot of fun and it has really held up well even after all these years. Of course, the funny thing here is that this is actually a fairly good and accurate reflection of what medieval football was like. You know, that's the game of football that existed before we came up with all these rules and regulations and whatever. And no, the original version of football was not soccer. I mean, if you look at this drawing of football from 1869, you'll see that the nature of the sport has changed a lot over time. But medieval football, also called mob football, was more like a barely organized riot than a sport with, rules. In fact, the mass sport was so violent and so crazy that it was specifically banned on public highways in England and Wales in the Highland Act of 1835. The old-fashioned form of this game usually involved some kind of ball and the residents of two different towns. The goal was to get the ball to a certain goal somewhere in your town, and people would basically risk their lives to do this. It's still played today in certain parts of England, and among the few rules is one that you can't kill players of the other team. And you thought modern football was violent, right? Anyway, this wasn't a soccer game at all. Instead, you would try to conceal this huge ball any way that you could to stop people from the other town of finding out where the ball was and following you and beating you up and taking it. The early forms of organized football at the English schools came after this type of medieval football, or mob football as they called it, and they resembled rugby a lot more than they resembled soccer. Believe it or not, modern American football is a lot closer to the original thing than modern soccer. Of course, Pigskin 621 AD isn't supposed to be like a simulation of medieval football, but it's surprising how close it comes to giving you that kind of experience. The brilliance of this game is that it shows that you can have fun playing football without needing a bunch of rules and starting and stopping. And this shows that Midway was growing up. You see, Pigskin is kind of like an extension of an idea that it had in an early arcade game, and I'm guessing that most of you have played this one. If you play Arch Rivals for just a couple seconds, you'll realize that it clearly shares the same hardware with Pigskin 621 AD. Arch Rivals has the same humor and violence and has that same zany feeling to it. The problem though is that Arch Rivals stops the action over and over again to show you these absolutely pointless cutscenes. I mean, I'm not going to complain about the cheerleader scenes obviously, but the thing is that it's hard to get into the flow of the game with all of this starting and stopping. Now, Pigskin 621 AD has a little bit of that, right? Especially with that kickoff part where it takes a little while to get things going, but fortunately they toned that down significantly. Now, the other interesting connection with Arch Rivals is that both games ran on exactly the same hardware, and these games were actually powered by the same processor that powered the Sega Genesis. That would be this baby right here, the famous Motorola 68000. That classic 16-bit feel is largely because of that famous Motorola processor. Anyway, Midway made a total of 7 games using the 68000 before moving on to more advanced hardware. That includes both Arch Rivals and Pigskin 621 AD. And Pigskin was actually the last Midway arcade game to feature the old 68000. Midway moved over to the TMS 34010 afterwards, which is the chip that powered High Impact, Mortal Kombat, and NBA Jam. In other words, when we look at Pigskin 621 AD, we're actually seeing the end of an era in Midway arcade games. In fact, in a very real sense, this is the culmination of arcade game ideas that Midway had been having for years. I mean, it says it right here, ancient arch rivals on a rampage. And so on the one hand, you've got the best ideas from arch rivals, which really wasn't all that bad to begin with. On the other hand, you've got the unapologetic violence and aggression of Rampage, another early Midway arcade hit. That's what Pigskin is like, except with a lot more violence, believe it or not. In particular, the final 2 quarters are fun because there are so many different ways to accidentally die. The whole thing is utter confusion and mass chaos, and that's a ton of fun. And of course, the coolest part is that you can see all of your stats, and we would have won this game if my teammates could, score. Now there's one more thing I should touch on at least briefly before we go. There was a home console version of this game as well, and I know about it, though I've got to admit that I haven't played it yet. Yeah, that would be this game, Jerry Glanville's Pigskin Football. Again, I haven't actually played this version yet, so I'm going to refrain from telling you my opinion at this time. We will keep this in our back pocket for a later video. Anyway, there you have it. This game is sort of like Mutant League Football, except it's horizontal instead of vertical, and you don't call any plays. It's more chaotic, but it's a ton of fun, and if you haven't played this game yet, you really should give it a try.